Okay, good evening for those of you who are here in the classroom this evening here on the campus, and to those who are online. I wanted to welcome everybody. My name's Mark Barnico, and I'm the executive director of the campus here in Hong Kong. I wanted to give a special shout out to some of our students who are here from UChicago. They're part of the LCK Young Global Studies Scholars program, and they're doing research with UChicago students working with Hong Kong University students together. So they just arrived a couple days ago, and I'm excited that they're all here. Some of them are here in the audience tonight. I want to welcome you all to the talk. It's a bit of a mouthful, this title, but Balancing Socio-Theoretic Traditions in Understanding Trauma and Mental Health, Evidence on the 3D Theory of Polyvictimization. We're going to talk about abuse tonight, and so I just want to make sure that people are aware of that, and if for any reason you feel uncomfortable, don't hesitate to take a break, leave the room. As always, we're sharing tonight's event on Zoom and Facebook and YouTube, and if you have a question that you want to ask with the online audience, you know how to do it. Just use the Q&A button on Zoom and ask the question. The team here will feed it to me, and I'll make sure that we ask the question of Professor Emery. I'd also encourage everybody, if you want to know what's going on this campus, please go to uchicago.hk, our website, and subscribe to eNews so you can keep abreast of all the programs that are going on here on campus. I'm really excited about this program tonight because this is our first Nexus Asia program. And Nexus Asia was an idea that we came up with on this campus to engage our UChicago PhD alumni who are actually working, teaching, doing their research in Asia at universities throughout Asia. It was an idea that we had to try to bring many of those PhD alumni faculty from around Asia to this campus to give talks, do workshops, collaborate, do research. So we really want to showcase our PhD alumni through the Nexus Asia program. So tonight's our first program with Professor Emery, and we're really excited about it. I'll tell you a little bit more about upcoming Nexus Asia programs that we have next week and in July. I'll do that at the end of the program. But in the meantime, we're delighted to have Professor Clifton Emery with us. He is Associate Professor of Social Work and Social Administration at the University of Hong Kong, as I mentioned earlier. He's a professor in social work at Charles Sturt University as well. He's a PhD alumnus of the University of Chicago, the School of Social Service Administration. Professor Emery is an academic, a social worker, and a statistician. His work focuses primarily on abuse and violence against women, children, and refugees. He's carried out that research in the United States, in Russia, and in many countries throughout Asia. So I think you'll find this to be a very interesting talk tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Emery to the stage.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here tonight at my alma mater and presenting at my alma mater. I'll just give a little bit of preface for this. And I see some of my students here actually joining us, which is nice. I've been studying violence against women for roughly 30 years and violence against children for 20 or 25. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I had to review a special issue on child sexual abuse, and I'll echo Mark's warning. These are unpleasant topics, and so if you're upset, feel free to take a break. But what I found myself thinking about was, we know child sexual abuse is horrible and it has horrible effects on people, and that's intuitive. And what I found myself pondering was, is it terrible because of the things that because of the reason we think it's terrible, or is it terrible for other reasons, right? So there's this sort of intuitive response we have of, oh, it's got to be horrible. It's sexual abuse. And what's horrible is that it's sexual abuse. But is that really what makes it horrible? And that's sort of what I was trying to think about. And eventually that course of thought became an article and then became theory and has since become a research agenda. But I'm going to start out, because this is looking at a theory, I'm going to start out talking not about the specifics, but about how one does theory appropriately, generally. Okay. So a brief overview, some notes on theorizing human decisions, actions, and experience. Then I will bring in the problem of multiple victimization. I'll introduce you to 3D theory in terms of its claims, the first of non-additivity, subjectivity, conceptual insufficiency of polyvictimization as currently conceptualized. Okay. And then the topology of invasiveness, exploitativeness, and severity. Then I will introduce some of the empirical work that looks at this so far. So there's a national study of Nepal. There is a random sample study of 200 Salar women from Qinghai province. There's a study that is ongoing in Turkey. There is a Han Chinese study. And finally, a national study of India that is underway. I don't have all the data for that, but we have pilot data from that. Okay, and then I'll discuss some of the implications. All right. So Chicago is famous for the revolution in behavioral economics. Long before that happened, Parsons argued that rational choice theory was insufficient to explain human decision-making on logical grounds. Okay? He argued that rational choice theory faced the horns of the utilitarian dilemma. Okay? On the subjective horn, this kind of theory retains a subjective ideal element, that is, a preference, and faces a constant reduction of tautology. And on the objective horn, utilitarian theory rejects ideal elements altogether. That's radical positivism. And it results in a determinism that can't explain revolutionary change. So circa 1937, this is what Parsons is arguing. Okay. And this is also characterized by empirical reductionism. All right, so there's our dilemma, okay, and the tautological horn and the incremental determinism horn. So I spent the first 2 or 3 years of my undergraduate career being educated by a social theorist who drilled this into us repeatedly so that we could just reel off the characteristics of utilitarian theory. He was obviously one of Talcott Parsons' students. Okay. So Parsons' basic building block for thinking about theory is the unit act. So think about anything you do, any conscious decision you make as an act, okay, a single decision or a single action. And he uses the components that sit inside of that act, the way that a theory thinks about that act, as a way of categorizing the theory. So in any unit act, you have at least a goal, okay, and a situation composed of means and conditions that affect your ability to get the goal, and at least one selective standard that's used to relate the end to the situation. That is, if I'm trying to get from here to there, okay, the conditions are I'm blocked by this, I need to go around it, right, to get here. And I walked in a straight line because that was efficient. But it wasn't the only way I could have gotten there. I could have climbed over the podium. Okay. In other words, there's at least one normative orientation that selects one act from among many possible, right? So what I just did was more or less rational because I took the easiest way to get there, or perhaps the most efficient way to get there, certainly the least disruptive way to get there. Okay. Basically, depending on what's in the unit act, 4 types of theory result. Radical positivism has no normative or ideal elements. There's no morality in there. There's nothing that you can't see. Okay? Utilitarian or rational choice theory has one ideal element, that is a preference. I prefer to take the most efficient way. Right? Okay? Or I prefer to walk over there. An idealist theory has all normative elements, no scientific knowledge or rational choice. And finally, voluntaristic theory has both kinds of elements. So it has ideal elements like norms about right and wrong, about whether it's right and wrong to walk over to that, but also rationality and scientific knowledge. This is the most efficient way to get there. And I'm going to walk around to distract you from the boringness of the lecture otherwise. All right. So what do you hope to do in this exercise? The first 3 chapters of the structure of social action was to transcend the positivist idealist dilemma or tradition. Now, that's a very old standard, but I've been teaching social theory, among many other things, the last 5 or 6 years. And this is still, I believe, a useful criterion for theorizing alongside things like statement logic and informal logic in terms of evaluating the theory you produce. Okay. So when I'm trying to theorize anything, this is always what's in the back of my mind. It should be voluntaristic. It should do full justice to human decision-making. We are both moral and calculating, right? And if we ignore either one of those, we're really not doing justice to the full breadth of what we're capable of. Okay? So my most recent theory is about traumatic victimization and mental health, and this isn't something new to me. It's something that I've been thinking about for decades now. So what are we talking about specifically? Okay? Polyvictimization is a new thing from my point of view, in studying violence against women and violence against children. Instead of just looking at, okay, were you physically abused? We look at, were you physically abused and neglected? Or were you sexually abused and emotionally abused? Okay, and how do these things combine? So it's experiencing more than one type of victimization, okay? And it is common in lower and middle income countries around the world. About 4 out of every 10 kids has a polyvictimization experience, okay? And about 1 in 6 Chinese people are polyvictims in their lifetime. And I'm just converting the prevalences here, okay? Finkelhor, who came up with this concept, he's a very, very famous guy who's been studying this stuff about twice as long as I have, argues that polyvictimization has lasting impacts on children. Not surprising, right? The thing is that research on single victimization, which is older, right, has similar findings. So when I see a new concept in social science, it makes me a little nervous, right? Not because that's bad. I think new concepts are good. But I worry about sensationalism. Like, oh, we're going to create the thing and it's going to be a big thing that's not really anything new, right? So there's a degree to which I'm cautious. And I felt a bit like this about this concept. It felt like there was a bit of a bandwagon effect, okay? So there are sort of 2 questions. One is polyvictimization greater than the sum of its parts? Okay, if we're just adding up, okay, well, you were neglected, plus you were sexually abused, plus you were physically abused. Well, I could have single victimization studies of all of those things. And if I can just add them up, I can just take coefficients from this, that, and the other thing and add them together, and then I know the effect of the 3 of them, right? If it's the same population, the same method. So that's the first question. Is it more than the sum of its parts? And what I'm going to be arguing to you tonight is, I don't think it makes sense to have it as a concept unless it's more than the sum of its parts, okay? And then the second part is, well, why would these be types? Physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. So I don't know who came up with all the specific types, but are those really types? On what basis do we believe that? Okay, so based on a lot of review of the literature up to the point that I published this thing, I argue, and we argue, that the theorization of polyvictimization is inadequate. And because of that fact, the contributions that polyvictimization research makes to knowledge are not as impactful as they could be, okay, are incremental rather than potentially revolutionary. Okay, that's the theory paper. So the question, one of the questions is, again, on what basis do physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and neglect constitute types? when I think about a type of violence or a type of experience, okay, I tend to think of a couple of different criteria for sorting it. One would be a common etiological pathway. The causal pathway is coherent, right? A second one would be that ontologically, the experience is similar, okay? And the third would be the trajectory of effects. The effect it has on my life or yours, if it happens to us, those effects are similar. Okay. So, another important issue with this is that in Parsonian terms, what we're looking at, or the way that this gets looked at, is empiricist. I don't mean that I'm against empirical research. I'm a statistician. I really like quant research, okay? What I mean is that ideal elements, okay, like perpetrator motivation, you can't see motivation, but it might matter a lot in terms of its effects, okay? Those things are ignored when we look at this phenomenon, okay? Instead, what we look at are observables like physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect, and we add them up, okay? What that means is that conceptualization of this phenomenon is one-dimensional. If we add them all up into the same thing, we have one dimension, okay? And I don't think this makes sense if there are truly different types or dimensions of victimization, because when you add a new dimension, you don't have, if you move from a line to a plane, you're no longer operating with linear increments. You go from a line to an area, that's multiplicative. Okay? Same thing when you move from a plane to a volume. It becomes multiplicative. So the argument here is you can't just add these up and get 4. And that is, I'm not kidding you, what we do, right? We get a big scale, we classify this, that, and the other event. Oh, you have 4, so you're 4. So you have 4 types of victimization. I have 4 types of victimization. We must be the same, right? The etiology should be the same. The experience should be the same. The trajectory should, do you see where this starts to fall apart? Okay, hopefully. It's okay if you don't. You can yell at me afterwards. All right. There's a lot of research suggesting more victimization is worse. That's intuitive, right? But that kind of approach fails to distinguish effects of polyvictimization from aggregated single victimizations, okay? If the effects of multiple victimizations are only additive, like I said before, we can just add up findings from separate studies and say, well, this coefficient, you know, the relationship between physical abuse and depression increases your score by 2 on the CESD on average, right? And the relationship in another study between sexual abuse and depression is it increases your score by 3 on the CESD. So then you've got 5, right? I don't need a study of polyvictimization to do that if it's additive. Okay. Again, if the combinations of types are only additive, I'm arguing we don't need this idea. So the only meaningful way to study this, I'm arguing, is non-additively. Now, that's actually in there from the get-go, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so yeah, I kind of already said this, so hopefully this is clear. Does this make sense to everybody? Okay. I don't want to beat a dead horse. Okay. All right. So we can just add up the effects on separate studies if we want to do that. Okay. All right. In this case, the whole is simply the sum of its parts. But even in the beginning, in 2007, when Finkelhor comes up with this process, with this idea of polyvictimization, he doesn't state that his argument is non-additive, okay, or multiplicative at all, but they do argue polyvictimization may have a larger impact than high-frequency single victimization, okay? Okay, so there's a non-additive justification, right? But that argument is, I would argue, premised on the law of diminishing marginal effects. That is to say, right, you have one act, you experience one act of physical abuse. Okay, there's an uptick, another act, but at some point there are basically diminishing marginal returns, right? This is a negative thing in this case, but the effects are diminishing over time. Okay. Now, that's important. It would make the case for a study of polyvictimization. Okay. But what we argue in our theory article, in this theory piece, is that that's not the most interesting or the most important way of thinking about combinations of different types of victimization. Right? Rather, what I worry about, I had a UChicago professor in policy school who used to tell us to lay awake at night and worry about autocorrelation in our data. So I lay awake at night and worry about that, but I also lie awake at night and worry about explosive combinations of victimization. Okay, that is to say, you know, you have this kind of victimization and that kind of victimization, they intersect, and suddenly you have an explosion in suicidal ideation. Okay, so now you've moved from low risk to really high risk. All right. Now, what we call this kind of situation is the multiplicative hypothesis. So instead of a relationship between types that is additive, okay, it's physical abuse plus sexual abuse, it's a multiplicative effect. And in a linear model, you'd be using an interaction effect to capture this. So, how do we map the minefield if there's an explosive combination like this? Okay, as a statistician or a quant modeler, what have you, the way that we do this is we still use linear models, but we model them with interaction effects. Okay, so that's the first claim of the theory. It's insufficient, and we need to predict non-additivity. Okay. The second is that we need to capture subjective experience, not just something that is objectively observable, like a bruise. Okay? It's important that we catch, and this is Parsons' argument as well. You lose the subjective, you lose all of this ideal, all the ideal elements. Okay? So you need people's experiences and voices to point us towards the most important parts of their victimization. Okay? And apologies to Gertrude Stein, we really need to consider whether the a bruise is a bruise is a bruise approach to things is serving us properly. Okay? So I want you to consider two realistic hypotheticals. Okay? You have Jimmy and Chotsu. They're both 12-year-old boys. Okay? Jimmy and Chotsu present with identical symptoms. 3 bruises across the back of the legs because they've been hit with a stick. Okay? By their father. Now, this is identical victimization from the existing paradigm. Okay? It's physical abuse. Done. Right? So if that's true, if this is the same type of abuse, then the causal pathway should be similar, right? The ontological experience of it should be similar, and the effect on Jimmy and Chotsu should be similar. Okay? In a very superficial way, it is. They both have bruises. Okay? But let me step back and tell you about how this happened. All right? So Jimmy came home from school. Okay? Walked in the door. Dad was sitting on the couch, drinking beer, watching football. Okay? And Jimmy walked in, and Dad said, "Hey, Jimmy, you get me my ciggies?" Okay, cigarettes, you'll detect my Americanness in this, right? And Jimmy says, "No, Dad, I'm 12. They won't sell me cigarettes." And Dad says, "What? You get me my ciggies?" He grabs a stick. He starts chasing Jimmy around the house, catches Jimmy 3 times across the back of the legs before Jimmy makes it out the door. Now, Chotsu comes home. Okay. Dad sitting on the couch, drinking a beer, watching soccer. Okay, Chotsu is a Korean name if you don't know. And Chotsu's dad says, "Chotsu, what did you get on your math test? Okay, and Charsu says, Dad, sorry, I studied, but I got a C. Okay, and Dad says, Charsu, you know what happens when you don't get at least a B. Stand against the wall. And Charsu has to pull up his trousers, and Dad takes three whacks with a stick on the back of his legs. Okay, now I don't want to minimize either of these things. They're both physical abuse. They're both not good for kids. Okay, but the important thing is this. Okay, what's the causal pathway look like here? Is it the same? Profoundly different. The experience in the moment is profoundly less terrifying for Charsu than it is for Jimmy. Okay? And the life trajectory change is completely different. When Charsu and Jimmy are 25, Charsu can look back on his childhood and say, my dad was physically abusive, but he cared about me. Jimmy may not be able to say that. And the emotional fallout from that difference could be enormous. Exactly the same empiricals on the surface, but profoundly different phenomena, arguably, I argue. Okay? All right, so if we're going to study the multiplicative hypothesis, we need to have the right types in the first place. And I'm not a big fan of taking everything at face value. Perhaps you've figured that out. So do we really have the right types? And this is what I was pondering. Okay. And of course, I came up with the answer no, because what else do I have to do, right? What types do we have, right? So existing research refers to types in terms of chronicity, severity, and empirically derived neglect, physical and sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. But what I'm suggesting to you is the type of abuse that Jimmy experienced and the type of abuse that Charsu experienced are not the same type of abuse. 2 acts of physical abuse, I'm saying, no, they're not the same thing. Oops. Okay, and similarly, okay, there might be an act of emotional abuse and an act of physical abuse, or an act of sexual abuse and an act of physical abuse that, even though they have separate empiricals, are actually having the same causal pathway, the same ontological experience, and the same trajectory, or at least close enough for our purposes. Okay. So, in general, all of these are determined by observables and uninformed by subjective experience. So the problem then is that the theoretical foundation for polyvictimization is insufficiently developed. Okay? What we argued, in addition to the foregoing, is that we have to articulate victimization and theorize it along at least three dimensions. Okay? How invasive it is, how exploitative it is, and how severe it is. Okay? And that's our three-dimensional figure. All right. I'll explain what those things mean. So the idea of invasiveness actually comes from medicine. Okay? Access to the body is gained, okay, when you put an instrument in, and ends when the instrument is removed. So you can think about having an endoscopy, okay? Or for women, a gynecological exam can be very invasive, even though the intent is benign. It is, frankly, speaking from some experience, not comfortable to have people stick instruments in your body, okay? That is invasive even when it's well-intended, okay? It's physically uncomfortable, okay? Now, our definition is related. It is when normative boundaries around the body or self are transgressed, okay? It may be emotionally and physically uncomfortable, even if the intention is benign. For example, forced feeding. This is not benign, okay? Munchausen's by proxy. Sexual abuse, sex trafficking, sexual assault. Organ trafficking, okay? Where someone persuades you to give up a kidney, all right? Okay, exploitativeness. Exploitation involves instrumental use of a relationship with another person for the purposes of self-gratification when there's a normative obligation to refrain from doing that. So it is a transactional approach, treating another person like an object. Now, we do that all the time when we're in the market and buy goods and services, but the point is that there's a normative obligation to not do that in this circumstance. Okay? For example, emotional abuse that conveys that children are only of value in meeting another's needs. Remember what I said about Jimmy? Why is the dad hitting him? Because he didn't get the dad his cigarettes. He's using Jimmy to get his cigarettes, even though that's not appropriate and it's not legal. Okay? Any form of trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, organ trafficking. Sexual abuse, assault, sadistic physical abuse. Okay? If dad is hitting you because he really likes hitting people and enjoys that, that is also exploitative. Okay? So again, sexual abuse and physical abuse supposed to be separate, but both can be exploitative. Okay? Severity at a minimum is a combination of chronicity, intensity, and probability of injury. Okay? I centered it around 0 because with children, abuse can cause mortality, but lack of care can also cause mortality. So fatalities occur with high positive or negative severity. Okay. So 3D theory argues that there will be 3-way multiplicative effects of the invasiveness, exploitativeness, and severity of polyvictimization. Okay, so the argument is that these things, when all of them are high, when you put them all together, explode in terms of the effects on the person emotionally. Okay? If I'm using a regression model, a linear model, what that means is a 3-way interaction effect, I times E times S, controlling for 2-way and main effects. I first tested, because this is a single author piece, the multiplicative hypothesis in a national study of almost 1,100 mothers and their adolescent children in Nepal. This was actually a Hong Kong GRF funded study, which I managed to get a few years ago, and we carried this out. So what we looked at was the mother's childhood 3D victimization and their adolescent child's depression. Okay. So this is an intergenerational hypothesis. The mother's victimization is affecting the child's mental health. Okay? So we hypothesized main effects of each of these. Okay? We also hypothesized, here's my interaction effect. Okay, a 3-way interaction controlling for the main effects and the 2-way effects. Okay? That's the 3-way multiplicative interaction effect. So hypothesis 4. Okay? It was a stratified 4-stage probability proportional size cluster sample of almost 1,100 mothers and their kids. Okay, this was 100 wards in 27 municipalities. We slightly oversampled rural areas. Okay, we ran it. I mean, there's a whole training that I make my interviewers, some of whom are here, go through. It's a 2-day training. Because this violence is really important to get right and also to protect participants from. You have to worry about whether the perpetrator's in the room, right? Things like that. So we have a 2-day training and an exam and an oral exam that you have to pass before you become an interviewer. All right. We translated it into Nepali and back translated it into English. Okay. So controlling for maternal depression, maternal borderline personality symptoms, physical abuse of the adolescent, neglect of the adolescent, sexual abuse of the adolescent, and demographics. Okay, we used regression models to deal with clustering by municipality. Okay, we used the CESD to measure adolescent depression. Okay, we explained what invasiveness was in this study. Okay, so we talked about sometimes during a bad experience, it feels like an invasion of your privacy, your body, yourself. You might feel like the experience has gotten under your skin, or even like your body's been taken over. And we ask people about the worst experience, victimization experience they have, and how invasive it was, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10. Similarly, exploitativeness. Okay, sometimes after or during a bad experience, you can feel used. Okay, someone is getting something from you without worrying about you at all, like doing something to hurt you just to benefit him or herself. Okay, again, on a scale of 1 to 10, the worst experience you rated. Okay, how exploitative was it? And then severity, we just generated a victimization count based on the CTQ, which is a standard measure of childhood trauma. Okay, that's those are the statistics from the univariate statistics from our Nepal study. These are I keep hoping that there's a pointer here, and I think there's not, so I'm not going to do it. There's not a laser pointer on this, right? Right? Okay, great, thanks. But if you look in the first column, you'll see statistics for the whole country. So you look and you'll see more than half of the adolescents had some symptoms of depression, okay? And 1 out of 4 adolescents had thought about suicide in the last 2 weeks. All right, and you can see also the neglect statistics, things like that are very high. Okay. These are our regression results, okay? So what you can see here is that in the main effects model, there's a significant positive relationship between invasiveness and adolescent depression. This is invasiveness as the mother reported it. So the mother is reporting invasive childhood experiences in victimization. And the adolescent separately, because we have reports from the mother about the mother and reports from the adolescent about the adolescent, separately, the adolescent is reporting depression or depression. Okay. Also, overall mother's trauma count, which is severity, was significantly associated with the adolescent child's depression. Okay. But we haven't tested the theory yet. These are just main effects. Okay. And again, when we looked at the adolescent suicidal ideation, okay, that's also exploitativeness of the mother's experience is associated with the adolescent's depression. But again, we haven't run it yet. Over here, the purple arrow is showing you the test of the 3-way multiplicative interaction effect. Okay? And what you can see there is it's significant and positive, controlling for main effects and 2-way interaction effects. Okay? With respect to depression, with respect to suicidal ideation, there was a 2-way interaction effect between exploitativeness and trauma count. What that means is, okay, and mother's depression, these were other risk factors in here. Okay. So this is a different way of looking at this 3-way interaction effect. Okay. In the first one, you're looking at it from the perspective of, as exploitativeness goes up, what happens to adolescent depression? Okay. As the exploitativeness of the mother's experience goes up, in single victimization and low invasiveness, you can see nothing's happening. Okay. If anything, that line is going down, although it's not significantly different from 0. When you have high victimization but still low invasiveness, there's a slight slope, okay, as exploitativeness goes up. But when you have the green line, high victimization and high invasiveness, suddenly going up in terms of exploitativeness is causing a lot of change. Well, okay, can't say causal, it's cross-sectional data, but looks like it's associated with a lot of change in adolescent depression. Similarly, this is the same interaction effect, but looking at it from the perspective of invasiveness, I'm going to need my water. When victimization is low, like you only have 1 victimization, and there's low exploitativeness, there's a slight increase, okay, as the invasiveness of the mother's childhood experience goes up, okay? With high victimization, that is like 4 victimizations, and low exploitativeness, again, you know, some change. But when exploitativeness is high and victimization is high, as you increase invasiveness, there's a large change in the amount of depression. Okay, so that was Nepal. The next study, and I should thank, where's Sylvia? This is Sylvia's dissertation work, is a study of 200 Salar women, okay, in Qinghai province. Okay. We looked at 3D childhood victimization and suicidal ideation. That's under review. And this is Sylvia's piece. 3D childhood victimization and neglect of your own children. That's published this past year. Okay. We've also got qualitative data that we're analyzing. Okay. Right. So Salar people are predominantly Muslim, Turkic ethnic minority in Qinghai County in Qinghai. They most likely came to Qinghai from Samarkand during the Tang or the Yuan. Okay. They're famous for entrepreneurship and business. Okay. Marriages are usually arranged, and there's a cultural tradition of child marriage, which was up until 2020 not banned. Polyvictimization rates may be high. Okay. And moreover, up until this time, there was no study of child maltreatment among the Salar. Okay. So we did PPS sampling of 5 out of the 9 Qinghai County districts. And in each district, 4 start points were randomly selected from the map, okay, using a uniform distribution. And 2 out of every 4 start points were drawn from areas near the river because that's where the population is concentrated. Okay. And then we interviewed the 10, actually Sylvia interviewed the 10 married women nearest to those start points. And I had these moments where I was running the sampling and got a point on a map and wondering, should I send Sylvia to this like remote mountain village where there are 3 houses? And if, you know, I'm strict, but I'm not that strict. So I just, okay, we're going to resample this one. But Sylvia very diligently went out and got this data. She did a great job. Okay. So 40 women were interviewed in each of the 5 districts. Okay. Nobody refused to participate. That's unusual. Okay. And we ran this through UChicago. That's the map that we used to sample Qinghai County. Okay. We measured suicidal ideation. I thought about suicide. I made plans to commit suicide in the past 1 to 2 weeks. Possible responses, not at all, less than 1 day, 1 to 2 days, like this. Okay. We also got women's self-reported physical and emotional neglect of their children. Okay. You had to leave your child at home alone, even when you thought you shouldn't. You couldn't tell your child you loved him or her. You couldn't get your child enough food. You couldn't get your child to the hospital or doctor when they needed to. Okay. I'm only showing you the regression models from this in the interests of keeping on time. Where are we in terms of time? Okay, great, thanks. So what you can see here is a 2-way interaction effect, no 3-way effect. Okay? My theory didn't work in this particular analysis. But a 2-way interaction effect between exploitativeness and invasiveness of the mother's experience in predicting her suicidal ideation. Again, that's potentially an explosive combination because it's multiplicative. All right. And there it is. Okay. These are the findings for neglect. Okay, in this one, again, this is Sylvia's first authored piece, published last year, right? You can see a positive 3-way interaction effect between invasiveness, exploitativeness, and severity, predicting mothers' self-reported neglect of their children. Okay. We have an ongoing study with a team in Turkey, collecting 1,000 mothers in Ankara and Istanbul. They're recruited from daycare facilities and primary schools, mothers of children aged 2 to 11. Preliminary analysis of about 1/3 of the data shows when we control for the mother's age, invasiveness and exploitativeness were strongly associated with mother's PTSD symptoms. Okay, that one was new. It's been an ongoing, yeah, I just analyzed this yesterday, so I can see you guys like, new data. Okay. Controlling for mother's age, childhood trauma, invasiveness is associated with medical neglect of children. Okay. And invasiveness and exploitativeness were associated with complex PTSD symptoms, controlling for age and CTQ, which is the trauma score. Now, all of those are betas, by which I mean a 1 standard deviation increase in invasiveness, in this case, for example, is associated with 0.18 standard deviation increase in CPTSD. Okay, so those are, it's just in terms of standard deviation increases instead of units, because Like what does a 1 on the 1 unit increase on invasiveness mean? We don't really know, right? Okay. Sylvia and I together, along with the rest of our team, developed a better measure than the 1 through 10 scale. So this is the pies. Your idea, not mine. We validated this measure. Okay, so we have between 4 and 6 items of invasiveness and 4 items for exploitativeness. Okay, it gets used in combination with the CTQ for adults or the JVQ for adolescents. Okay, and we validated this on a non-random sample of adolescents, Chinese adolescents in 2 schools. Okay. We randomly assigned the entire sample to an estimation sample on which we did exploratory factor analysis and a validation sample on which we then did confirmatory analysis. If you're not familiar with this approach to factor analysis, it's a lot like data mining properly, right? You randomly assign your data into 2 different groups. You develop a model on the first group, okay, but then you test it on the second group, which has never seen the model before. Okay. We had good internal reliability for this scale, and there was a strong 2-factor fit on the validation sample, right? So generally, if you see the RMSEA below 0.05, that's good. CFI 99 and TLI 99, that's also good. And unlike most things, when the model fit is not significant in a factor analysis model, that's a good thing. Okay. All right, and maybe for me, more importantly, the new scale is significantly correlated with child sexual abuse. That is to say, you're more likely to endorse invasiveness and exploitativeness. When you see this, remember that's where we started with the whole thing, okay? Also associated overall with the trauma score on the JVQ, this speaks to criterion validity, okay? And finally, also positively associated with adolescent depression symptoms, and a different scale, not the CESD. All right, that's our factor analysis. Okay, you put these items, you can see the items up there. For exploitativeness, I felt used. I felt like it was done only for the other person's benefit. I felt taken advantage of. I felt like I was sacrificed for someone else's benefit. And then invasiveness, it got under my skin. I couldn't wash or brush it off. I felt like what had happened got deep into my body, not just on the outside. Okay. We've got an R&R on that from child abuse and neglect. Okay. And these are Likert scale questions, so 4-point Likert scale. All right. We also have an ongoing national study of India, which is a 4-stage cluster sample of 2,000 mothers and daughters in 18 states and Delhi. That's in 44 wards and 36 villages. Okay. To date, okay, we don't have a ton of data. We have 58 mothers and adolescent daughters in 3 states because we just started last month. Okay. But we've got this scale in this data, and I ran the analyses on the pilot. And we've got good reliability for these same items. And I ran factor analysis, confirmatory factor analysis on the scale and got, again, encouraging results on the pies. And again, for me, important, invasiveness and exploitativeness were significantly and pretty strongly correlated with mothers' PTSD symptoms. And yeah, holding age, invasiveness, and total victimization constant, exploitativeness predicts PTSD. And that's, we've only got 58 people in that analysis, so it's not like we've got a ton of statistical power to detect effects. So what do we do with all this? Very, very nerdy, abstract talk, but where does it get us? All right, so we've got multiple samples from East Asia, South Asia, and West Asia, okay, Asia Minor. In all those samples, 3D theory seems to be implicated with intergenerational effects of trauma on depression, suicidal ideation, neglect, PTSD. What we are doing is attempting a paradigm shift in the study of psychological trauma and violent victimization. Okay. The shift is away from additive, adding everything up, observable events. You would not believe how popular that is. Have you ever heard of ACEs? Adverse childhood events? Okay. Everybody adds them all up. That's the thing. Okay, were your parents divorced? Your parents have an addiction. Did they ever go to jail? And you just add all this up and there's your score. Okay. I review this stuff a lot. I produce some of it, but I secretly hate it, I guess. I don't really hate it, but I don't think it's serving us or helping us to better protect vulnerable people. And that's my job, right? I'm a social worker. That's my job, is to protect children. Okay, figure out better ways to protect children. And so if we're just adding things up and that's not really helping, I'm not really doing my job, and it bugs me. Okay? So what we're trying to do, this is arguably a voluntaristic theory, is move from this, the old paradigm, where all we're looking at is severity. Okay? Okay, you got frequency on the bottom, and then severity goes up with frequency. Okay, however much you're experiencing, just add it up. Okay, we're trying to move the field from this to this. The new paradigm is polyvictimization in 3 dimensions. Okay. Broadly, conceptualization of trauma and measurement of trauma should take advantage of dimensionality arguments to articulate multiplicative rather than additive contributions to risk and protection. That is, scholars, social workers, clinicians, policymakers should be looking for bombs, explosive combinations of effects. And actually, I don't care if this is right or wrong. I mean, I kind of care. I'm finding out whether it's right or wrong. But even if it's wrong, I don't mind if it changes the way that we think about this, if we move beyond, oh, clickety, click, 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 add it up. Okay. Specifically, okay, if this keeps getting replicated, concepts of invasiveness and exploitativeness may need to be explicitly incorporated into theory, research, and practice and policy on traumatic violence and abuse. We need to rethink how we approach the study of psychological trauma and mental health. Okay? Theorizing and examining toxic combinations of trauma that increase risk exponentially could be used to identify clinical and policy priorities for prevention and treatment. We're in Hong Kong. You know there is a mental health crisis here. You know what happens. You know that the suicide rate is way too high. What are we doing about it? This is what I want to throw at it. I want to do something about it, and I want to throw the very best theory, the very best substantive knowledge, the very best research, the best we've got at it, the best methods. That's your responsibility. That's what UChicago taught me. You throw the best you've got in all the dimensions you've got at whatever problem you're trying to understand. Okay? We need more research, but 3D theory is already showing some empirical promise. Okay? But justice to this phenomenon, this should not be the last word. I want researchers and scholars to use your imagination, okay? And your experience. You pull everything you've got at it. So more theory, not less. Someone needs to turn around and develop a new theory once I've figured out how much support this one has and overturn mine. That's how we move forward and better protect people. Even if this promise, the promise of this theory, peters out, I'll judge this as being successful if we shift the conceptualization of trauma. We need longitudinal and experimental evidence from RCTs on subjectively experienced exploitativeness and invasiveness. Okay? If we keep seeing support for this hypothesis, okay, we need to prioritize prevention and treatment specifically of trauma that is invasive and exploitative in research, policy, and practice. We need to worry about those kids and adults who have this particular intersection We need more research, money, and policy focus on exploitative sexual abuse, as well as the division of other types of violent trauma in which the perpetrator's motivation is exploitative. Child welfare needs to prioritize prevention and treatment of exploitative, invasive childhood trauma, rather than treating it as a bruise is a bruise is a bruise. Okay? And we need to better understand how perpetrators colonize and use other people and how to prevent it. Okay? Like all research and theory, this has limitations. The data so far are cross-sectional, non-experimental, and not causal necessarily. We need to replicate this in a larger array of samples globally. The relationships need further clarification with complex PTSD. We need to better understand the partial findings, main effects and two-way interaction effects. Why are they there instead of three-way effects? Okay. We need better qualitative data and we need to publish it. Okay. And as always, victimization estimates are almost certainly under reports. Okay. In conclusion, mothers, adolescent children are vulnerable to depression, suicidal ideation, neglect, and PTSD, and this seems to be related to 3D aspects of childhood trauma. Future research needs to be conducted globally on larger samples with expanded measures, as well as relevant measures of culturally constructed self-concept, which may be one pathway by which this operates. Policymakers need to consider new criteria for preventing mental health risks from violence, and a lot of work remains to be done. Nonetheless, vulnerable and traumatized people, and particularly children, deserve the best we've got. Thank you. And thank you. And before I take questions, I just want to thank all of the people. This kind of research doesn't get done without a ton of support. So thanks to the Turkey team, the India team, the Nepal team, and everybody in my lab who's been doing a fantastic job contributing to this and moving this agenda forward. So you deserve a round of applause.
Should we start with some questions? Who has questions or comments from people who work with Professor Emery, maybe on any of their experiences? Don't be shy. Use this.
I see a hand over here.
Use this microphone too if you have a question. Oh yeah, go ahead, Robbie. You just press the button.
Hi, my name is Ravi. I'm a rising third year at the college, majoring in biology and computer science. I just have a small question about the Nepal study on the slides. It had the girls column with a square on it. I wanted to know if that was intentional or not.
Okay, let me go back there. So it had the column with a square on it?
Yeah, like girls exponent 2.
Oh, okay, let me find that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's a footnote. I don't
okay.
remember what the footnotes, I'd have to look it up, but that's a footnote from the article. Thank you for the question. Yeah, so it's not squared. It was just some note about that subsample, probably that we're generalizing it to the population. But yeah, thank you for the question, Robbie. Nice to meet you.
I was curious how you chose Nepal as a place to do this research. What was the rationale behind that?
Sure. So this study started in 2020, but I'd actually been working on data in Nepal for, 7 years before that. So I've done research on child abuse and IPV, intimate partner violence, and also sex trafficking of children in Nepal for the last more than 10 years now. That got started in part because I had a student from Nepal. This was at Yonsei. But I've been there several times, and including to train to do this research. I just think it's a really interesting place. It's also very interestingly ensconced right between two major powers and civilizations, Indian, South Asian, and Chinese civilization, right? So I think they kind of sit at an interesting nexus. Oh boy, I pulled that one out of the hat. I also think that, well, know that it's a relatively poor country, under-resourced, came out of a civil war, you know, like I think it was about a 10-year civil war from roughly 2000 to 2010, not exactly. So there's a lot going on there in terms of child well-being and IPV as well. But I'm very intellectually curious about all kinds of places around the world. So I tend to, you can see where the research goes, all these different places. In part, that's because I find culture fascinating, wherever I find it. And so there's always an appeal that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, this idea of culture too, I think is really interesting, to think about how these behaviors get passed down through various traditions and cultures.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you're finding that in the various parts of the world that you're working in, but
I do try to operationalize cultural variables, in that, like, I either work with people from that culture or it's something that I know very well already. Like I know Western culture relatively well, at least American culture, but I also speak Korean and lived there for many years. That said, it seems that, at least based on this stuff, that some things are generalizable beyond specific cultures. It seems that nobody likes feeling used. Everyone gets uncomfortable if you stick something into them when they don't want that. So there's some universal aspects of being human and existing in a human body. And to some extent, my work taps into that, right? And then the other piece of that, and this is where I think culture becomes incredibly important, is what are the hermeneutics of that experience? How does your culture interpret what happened to you, right? And the reason that I can talk about Chorsu is Chorsu's a Korean boy, and I've lived in Korea, a total of about 11 years, but on and off, spread between now and 1994. I don't like dating myself that way, but fine. That's how Korean parents used to discipline their kids. It was normative, right? You take a stick, you whack your kid on the back of the legs, okay? So from Chorsu's perspective, if he's growing up circa, I don't know, 1990, this is what happens to everybody. It's unpleasant, I don't like it, but it doesn't have any special meaning about the relationship you have with your parents. And that's important, okay? Because later, yeah, Chorsu is going to recognize, actually, that was physical abuse. But he's also going to recognize, if he's thinking about it in a reflective person, well, my parents aren't perfect, but they love me. And that's a profoundly protective reflection, I think. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Adi. I'm a second year at the college. Thank you for your time. Wanted to ask you a question. You mentioned your interviewers take like a course 2-day basically process, and you mentioned like having a perpetrator in the room changes responses. And then later in the presentation, you also mentioned that there tends to be a lot of underreporting in this field. Can you talk about how you guys factor that into your research? If there are any methods or perspectives you guys take to deal with that?
That's a great question, Adi. Thank you for it, and it's nice to meet you. Yeah, the bottom line is you can't have a potential perpetrator who can watch the research process. Okay, that's just a rule we have. So part of the training involves you're doing the survey with someone. Are you monitoring the environment for threats to confidentiality? That's important in any social science endeavor, okay? Surveys are supposed to be confidential, but you might not be that uncomfortable if you're answering how many years of education you had, right? It is vitally important if your answers on a particular survey, if seen by the perpetrator, will later occasion a beating, right? So that's one of the reasons that we sensitize our interviewers to the issues of violence against women and children first, and talk about this and then train them to monitor the environment consistently and to stop. You shut it down if confidentiality is violated, and you need to act, and we train people to do that, so that, you know, basically, it's a judgment call, right? Because you don't know that the person who just walked in the room is a perpetrator. You don't know that, right? You also don't know whether they can be successfully diverted so that the interview can continue with confidentiality and privacy, or whether it is, you know, a kind of, nope, it's ending here because we've lost confidentiality and we're not going to get it back. It's also not easy in other contexts because in some, like this is what we're dealing with in India, for example, everybody's interested when the interview team comes to town, right? And then we're trying to navigate this process in that context where, oh, it's not just your extended family that's interested in what you're doing, but the whole neighborhood wants to see, you know, and then how do you deal with that? And so that's something that we also have to navigate on the fly. It's not something that we can know a priori all the time. So that's why we sensitize our interviewers so that they can make intelligent decisions and informed decisions on the ground. Does that make sense? Thank you for the question. Yeah. Other questions?
Anybody else? Questions online? Would anybody online like to ask any questions? We don't have any. Okay.
Going once.
You got one, I know, because you're smiling, so.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm Megan. I'm from Poland Czechia School, just graduated. And I just want to ask, if 3D theory were to be replicated, maybe not in Asia or in like Western countries, what are some expectations, especially with culture mentioned? I expect, for example, the idea of like diasporas and also like first generation immigrants, there might be a difference in how the 3D theory may be presented, right?
Absolutely. And I think that in a diaspora situation, you have all kinds of impacts of migration. I mean, a fundamental one is whether migration is voluntary, right? So there's a difference between being a migrant and a refugee, and it's important, right? But there are also generational effects of being a migrant. So the parents, you know, the people who first go, assuming they're migrants and not refugees, made a choice, right? They were agents in the decision to come to this place, however wonderful or crappy it may turn out to be, right? But their children were not agents in that decision. And in my experience, often spend a lot of their childhood being told by the dominant culture, you're really this, okay? You're really Chinese. You're really Korean. You're really, you know, wherever it is your parents came from, that's really you. And so there's this expectation of both a feeling of alienation, and this is tied into the racism, obviously, right? Alienation from this place where you were born and affiliation to the place where your parents came from. But then what happens? Okay, well, when you're a kid, maybe your parents speak Chinese, your parents speak Korean. And then you turn 12, 10 or 12, and you want to be like other kids, and you don't want to do that. So you stop speaking the language that your parents speak to you. You become fluent in, well, English, okay, if that were French, whatever it may be. You lose some of your facility with your parents' language of origin. Then you come back to Korea or China or Japan or South Asia or India or wherever it may be. And what happens to you? You're not really Chinese. You don't speak Chinese. You're not really Korean. You're, you know, there are all kinds of epithets. African Americans have the epithet of Oreo, right? Black on the outside, white on the inside. Okay? Or I get called an egg, so it switches around. Or what's the other one? Twinkies, right? Yellow on the outside, white on the inside. This epithet. So you're denied authentic belonging in both places, right? I think that's profoundly alienating and has its own negative effects on you, right? And then whatever other trauma you're experiencing through life, because we experience it, gets mixed into that in probably very toxic ways. right? So yeah, that would absolutely, and actually will absolutely be something I study going forward. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Hi, this is Ravi again. I have another question. In your presentation, you specifically note that exploitativeness predicts PTSD if invasiveness and victimization are held constant for one of the studies. And I wanted to know, in your multiplicative hypothesis, when you have all three dimensions multiplied together, does one have more predictive power than the other in any way?
Ooh. Well, that's a great question. And you know, because that's a three-way interaction model with two-way effects and main effects, that's really hard for me to answer except by looking at the thing that I made, which is why I'm glad I made it. So let's look at that for a second, and then we'll know, because that's based on the regression model, right? So here we go. Okay. So yeah, I wouldn't be able to just look at all those coefficients and go, oh, well, it does this, right? But this is basically looking at single victimization, that is trauma count is 1, and low invasiveness would mean invasiveness is at 1, and then you're looking at exploitativeness. So what have we got here? Between 1 and 5, all right, and it's the same, it's reciprocal for invasiveness, for the invasiveness one. So between 1 and 5, exploitativeness in the green line is going up from 4 to 8, right? And the same distance here, it's from 4 to 7 for invasiveness. No, sorry, 2 to 7. So that's 5 versus 4. So it looks like invasiveness, the slope is a little bit higher than exploitativeness, although, I mean, I need to run a significance test on that to see whether or not, you know, that difference is significant. But it looks like the invasiveness is a little bit more impactful than the exploitativeness under the same conditions, the same interaction effect.
And how does that interact with severity?
Severity is in here. So severity is measured by victimization count.
Yeah. Oh,
Right?
okay.
So that's, you're going up from orange to blue to green severity.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the questions. Other questions?
I have another question.
Yeah.
You were very passionate about mental health of Hong Kong and suicide rate.
Yeah.
In Hong Kong.
Yeah.
The question is, aren't we doing enough here? And if not, what more could be done? And how are we being served by the institutions that are supposed to be helping people with mental health issues? And
Thank you for the
I'll
question,
just
Mark.
stop
Yeah.
it there.
No, thank you for the question. Look, our efforts are only as good as our information. So our efforts are only as good as we understand why people commit suicide in the first place. Sorry, I'm not supposed to say commit anymore. It's an old habit. It's something that I'm passionate about. It's also something that I'm intimately familiar with. As an adolescent, I was suicidal. So I've been inside of that box, right? And it's horrible, which is why one of the reasons that I am passionate about stopping it, right? I'm certainly glad that I didn't, you know, that I lived through my adolescence, and I might not have. But the animus that you're feeling from me, the energy that you're feeling from me is not like a condemnation of the efforts that are being made. There are a lot of people out here who care about it, right? There are a lot of people at HKU who are trying to do something about it. Paul Yip has a whole center devoted to it, right? But again, our interventions are only as good as what we know. And so if what we know comes from doing the same thing over and over again, rehashing the same risk factors over and over again in slightly different populations, okay? Looking for sort of buffering or resilience or this sort of thing, all old concepts that have been lying around forever, no imagination. This bothers me, right? If you don't worry about what's really going on, you have to engage not just the heart, but the intellect, right? What really causes this? Yeah, we've got some theories, but are they right? Are they coherent? Are they sufficient? Okay. And I mean, some other classes I'll go through and I'll classify, you know, there's a whole, the interpersonal theory of suicide, okay, Joiner's theory. means, okay, you've got a sense of a thwarted belongingness, okay, increases suicidal ideation, and a sense of perceived burdensomeness, okay, increases suicidal ideation. Now, I had a student a few years back, Vera Munn, who graduated. She studied suicide among cancer patients, so we sort of went over this. And when I sort of encountered this theory, what went through my mind was Parsons. Gee, perceived burdensomeness. What is that? That's an ideal element. You can't see it. Okay? Thwarted belongingness. That's an ideal element. You can't see it. You're missing, in this case, the positivistic stuff. That's all well and good. That might motivate you to commit suicide, to carry out a suicide. But if you don't have the means to, if you're locked up in a hospital, okay, or you don't have the actual means to carry out suicide, ain't gonna happen, right? One of the phenomena that Vera found looking at cancer patients was the suicide rate ticked up when people left the hospital. That's because it's really hard to carry out a suicide in the hospital, right? It's simply like the material conditions are not there. So I looked at that theory and said, where are the material conditions, right? And this is something that she did in her dissertation, was this theory needs to be fixed, right? So that's where I'm kind of pushing us. You know, we need to understand the phenomenon better, and that means we need to engage at the theoretical level, not just the substantive level and the methodological level. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I mean, people are trying, but as a social worker, I can tell you, goodwill and a good heart gets you some of the way, but it's not enough. Thank you.
It's a good place to end. Goodwill and the good heart. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much,
Professor
for
Emery.
the opportunity to talk.
I'll make a couple announcements here and let our online audience have a good evening, I guess. I just want to mention, first of all, that our next Nexus lecture is going to be given next week, June 18th at 6:30, same time, by Professor Shali Wu. And the topic is Rationality in Context, Behavioral Economics, and Cognitive Bias from East to West. And I think all of these are on our website, right? So people, if they're interested in digging in more and seeing a description of the topic, they can go there and see that. July 24th at 6:30 p.m. So we're in July now with Professor Amir Hampel of NYU Shanghai will be here. And he'll be talking about unruly spirits, the rise of Chinese medicine therapies for autism and ADHD. And we have two topics that are going to be covered by Nexus lectures on autism. So this is one that relates to Chinese medicine for autism and ADHD. So should be pretty interesting to hear some of those topics discussed by our Nexus professors. I'd also like to just mention, as I always do, that our campus hosts a podcast. We produce the podcast here. It's called The Course, and we feature about 150 of our UChicago faculty on The Course podcast, where you can hear the professors' journeys and how they became professors. So we talk a little bit about their research, but more about their experience and how they became professors. So I just wanted to make sure that I give our podcast a shout out and thank everybody online for being here. And for those that ventured into the rain, if it was raining as you were on your way here, thank you for coming and being here in person. Thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Emery. Have a good evening.